Welcome to Themis Podcasts. Themis is an award-winning platform that helps our clients and community manage their financial crime risk exposure. We aim to democratize due diligence through our AI-powered AML and KYC platform, our expert research and insight into emerging financial crime threats, and our deep dive intelligence for enhanced due diligence. Find out more at wearethemis.com.
Hello and welcome to the Themis Podcast. I'm Henry Wyard, part of Themis's international team of financial crime researchers, investigators and technologists. And I'm delighted to be joined today by my colleague, Eliza Thompson, for the latest episode on our series on fraud, which is taking us around the world, under the skin of the latest tech developments and inside the operations of criminal organizations, to understand what's happening right now in the big, bad world of fraud. You can find out all about these in our latest magazine, False Profits, which includes an excellent piece on the professionalization of global scam centers, written by my very esteemed guest today. Eliza, welcome to the podcast.
Great, thank you for having me.
Well, before we get into talking about your research, I want to start with a very simple and easy question, which is how did you get into the world of anti-financial crime?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm part of the Insight team, which we research emerging threats across the financial crime space, from specific crime types, criminal networks, to the policy side as well. I've always personally been really interested in the intersection of international security and financial crime. So things around perspective of global power, influence, instability, basically how criminal groups weaponize broader dynamics happening globally. So things like political unrest, economic trends. And then from there, I think I've really become more interested in the role of technology in all of it as well. So how AI and other emerging tech areas impact these dynamics. We can't in this world separate out technology from other aspects of the economy or politics. It all really goes together in that sense. And from there, a key part of this is really fraud and how much it's grown and become sophisticated in recent years. So I think tech has really unleashed a floodgate in terms of just how large scale fraud is today. So yeah, I think that's kind of my background in terms of how I've come to all these issues coming together into kind of one interesting research area.
Well, that's a fascinating set of research specialisms. I thought your latest piece was really one of the most interesting that I've read in this area. So to start, could you briefly, for our audience, outline the focus of your recent article? So what was the key issue you were aiming to highlight, and why in particular did it feel important to explore at this point in time?
Yeah, definitely. So my piece is about the rise of what are called scam centers. So these large scale industrialized and very professionalized fraud operations that are becoming more common around the world. So these operations often look and sound like legitimate businesses. So whether it's a tech company, tech support company, they kind of try to appear as these legitimate businesses, but behind the scene, they're carrying out massive fraud instead. So what really drew me to the topic is how these operations reflect so many of the trends we're seeing today in fraud and also in financial crime more broadly. So, it's not just about someone clicking on a suspicious link or a phishing email anymore. It's really more of an entire ecosystem. So one that blends technology, professional services, business infrastructure, financial networks, and criminal behavior. So it all kind of creates this one, high functioning, scary ecosystem in that sense. And then also, sadly, it often overlaps with other issues such as forced labor, human trafficking. And then oftentimes, the criminal groups behind these are funding other things, from drug trafficking to even conflict financing, for instance. And then just because of the scale of it, the financial losses and emotional trauma for victims is really high now. So, it's all kind of creating this perfect storm in a sense. And then we're also seeing a wider range of victims. So people who previously might not have been kind of what we think of as the typical fraud victim are falling for these scams as well. So yeah, I just, thought it was a really interesting kind of trend to be following.
Yeah, and in your piece, you raised some really interesting points about just how professional that ecosystem has become. Could you expand on the key findings and insights that you wanted to bring out in the piece?
Yeah, definitely. So, what intrigued me the most was about how these centers operate in a way that really closely mirrors legitimate businesses, as you said. So, you might typically think of a scam as an online scam as one guy behind, sitting in his basement behind his laptop typing away. But in reality, it's often far more organized, which is honestly far more unsettling. So, in some parts of the world, entire office buildings or even whole mini towns, in a sense, are being built. So, for instance, you might see these industrial complexes that are being built, especially in certain regions, and they feature offices, lodging for workers, whether dorm style or even housing, and even restaurants or bars for entertainment. So, in one report I saw, for instance, there was this really large complex linked to Chinese fraud networks that had karaoke bars, for instance. So, yeah, it's just I think really startling, the scale of everything and just how kind of massive it's become. But the goal of these centers is really what we typically think of and what we traditionally think of. So it is people making phone calls or text messages or social media messaging to try and trick people into taking some sort of action. So this could be investing in a fake crypto platform, a real estate scam. It could also be them trying to pose as a bank representative to get you to hand over your information, your bank account information. It could also be, these fake companies that are offering prizes or pretending to refund a product that you purchased. And I think that's honestly one of the scariest things is that these fraud operations can oftentimes can purchase information. So they can either see your online activity or personal information. And then that can really legitimize how they're approaching it. So they engage you in a way where you think, how could they possibly know that unless they're legitimate? But while the tactics are familiar, the thing that is kind of not common, that's now the dangerous aspect of it, is just how sophisticated they're becoming. So they're really being run like full blown businesses. So they use, as I said, marketing data, they're purchasing information on people. They're using digital tools such as sales software to track contact details, even have conversations on potential target or notes on potential targets. So they might say, this target was on the phone for 25 minutes talking about X. And so they can really track very systematically in that sense. And then they're also using AI to craft messaging now. So that really makes it really fast, cheap, and they can even do it in different languages. So yeah, I think just one of the things that stood out most to me was really the use of tech and the use of really these kind of legitimate business softwares and practices. And that makes it really hard for law enforcement to shut them down because it's really hard to even identify them. And then sadly, it means that, more people can be targeted at scale and in more sophisticated ways. And then, as I also mentioned, oftentimes it's linked to, forced labor and human trafficking. So there's that added element of kind of a two-sided tragedy in that sense, where oftentimes the people that are carrying out the fraud aren't doing it by choice. So they're sometimes forced themselves. So you have both the fraud victims, but also the people having to be forced into doing these fraud schemes as well. So yeah, I think those were kind of the overarching things that stood out to me.
That's quite a chilling picture that you paint, and it sounds like there's all sorts of different things to be worried about. But I wondered whether there are any particular cases that you came across in your investigations, in your research, that you think drive home the overall problem. Are there any particularly terrible or frightening instances that you came across or that you think really kind of encapsulate the overall problem?
Yeah, definitely. I think the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project did a really interesting investigation into these fraud centers recently that was really well done. So, one case I came across that they exposed was a scam center operating out of Eastern Europe that was passing itself off as a legitimate telemarketing firm. So, on the surface, it really looked just like a telemarketing startup. It was founded by two seemingly successful business people. The company even had HR department, so they had protocols for hiring. And yeah, it just, the way that they were running was very much what you would think of as legitimate. But then behind the scenes, they were actually targeting people with fake crypto schemes. So they were running flashy ads online that they had purchased. They were trying to convince people to invest in these fake crypto platforms. They also were targeting ambitious young people as the people they were hiring. So they were, advertising high pay, really high incentives to get people to kind of join the company. And then once people joined, they kind of realized what they were a part of might not have been as legitimate as it seemed. And that was really interesting to kind of see how people stayed and continued working. And then they even had, freelance marketing consultants they used. So yeah, it was very interesting to see how it was running as a company in a sense. And I think in total, they convinced hundreds of victims to invest thousands into these fake crypto platforms. So just the scale of it as well, again.
That is a vast scale. Are there any statistics or data that help us get a sense of how that translates globally? Are there a couple of these types of enterprises, or are there really hundreds, thousands? I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it's always so hard to put numbers on these things because, just by the nature of it, every one you uncover, there's going to be many that you don't. And obviously, they're not reporting their own profits. But I think, for instance, in the US, there's one study that showed that victims lost 5 billion last year alone to these kinds of scam centers, and the UK lost a similar amount last year. So that shows just how massive the threat is, especially for, countries like the US and the UK that are often targeted because they have higher income victims. And then interesting, there was a study in the UK as well that I thought really showed kind of the threat, where it was looking at call related fraud specifically. And it showed that roughly 4 scam calls per month were received by victims. And that equated to, I think, about like 450 minutes of unwanted calls being targeted towards the victim. So you realize oftentimes victims kind of hold out for a while, but then finally, they're being bombarded and then they give in. And I think that also shows kind of the role of automation and how, again, they can be conducting so many calls now. So one of them is going to hit. And yeah, I think that, again, this also shows that while the profit is really increasing, the consequence for criminals is actually alarmingly low still. So the UK, for instance, which takes fraud really seriously and has really strong, law enforcement, regulatory system, they still just are able to solve about 1 in every 100 or 1,000 fraud cases. So again, it's just really alarming how little these people are actually being put to justice as well.
So do you think that's a question of the issue not being paid enough attention, or is it more a question of essential ability to deal with the issue? How would you look at it?
I would say it's definitely a resource thing. I mean, I think in the UK, for instance, fraud is being paid attention to very seriously. It's just a matter of, it's oftentimes these are international organizations and they're operating out of jurisdictions that might have weaker enforcement or even look the other way on purpose. So I think often it's just a matter of it's really hard logistically, legally, to even go after these organizations. And oftentimes victims don't report it either because they're either ashamed or they might not even realize what happened, or they just don't think it's worth reporting even. So I think it's a combination of things. But what's scary is that I don't think it is about not paying attention. I think it's very much just that it's hard to get the root of the issue right now.
And do you see that changing anytime soon? How do you see, well, I suppose, both trends within fraudsters, within these professional scam organizations, but then also in law response, etc.? How do you see that changing over the next few years?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think hopefully it's a matter about more governments can kind of come together and work in terms of cross country. So I do think that there is kind of that push right now, especially because a lot of these organizations, fraud centers, are linked to things like human trafficking, even local conflict financing. So there's that kind of, again, international security or geopolitical element. So I think that hopefully it's a matter of, better intelligence sharing, maybe more awareness in terms of educating the public as well. So if we can make it so people really are aware of the scale of it, then hopefully fewer victims. And then it's also about just trying to de-incentivize these companies. So if you make it so that, the consequences of being caught is just so extreme, then hopefully fewer of these maybe smaller or medium organized crime enterprises might be disincentivized, at least, to really kind of continue building these types of operations.
That's fascinating. Hopefully we can get some traction there. And I know that you mentioned that sometimes people who are victims of these scams feel too ashamed to report, too ashamed to maybe pass on information to the police that could actually support their cases and maybe get some redress and some recovery of the stolen funds. I wonder whether there are any practical takeaways that you could recommend for our listeners, I suppose both in their personal lives, but also for those of us in the audience who do work professionally in the field of anti-financial crime or even beyond within businesses. What are some of the key practical things that we can do to help protect ourselves against these threats?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think from a kind of private sector perspective in terms of companies, entrepreneurs, I think one big thing is just how even well-meaning companies can get caught up in these schemes unknowingly. So again, these scam centers were using legitimate service providers, from marketing professionals, even, the landlords that are renting on the office space. So I think that's a big thing where it's not just, okay, I'm not doing business with some unsavory front company that's registered in some offshore jurisdiction. It's also about making sure that, it could seem like a very legitimate business, and you really need to do your due diligence and make sure that you're not inadvertently enabling these fraud schemes. So I think that's really kind of the big maybe takeaway or call to action would be just thinking about how, as fraud is getting smarter, we have to also get smarter in how we fight it. So whether you're a bank, freelance, offering tech support, you've really got to make sure that you are looking at who you're doing business with and their network and what their income streams are, and really making sure you're not passive in terms of that. Because I think that's exactly what these fraud organizations are hoping for, is that we're all just kind of passive and thinking that we're not a part of the potential risk, when in reality, a lot of companies might accidentally be connected without knowing.
And I think the fact that we're having conversations like this to both talk about the issue, quite how widespread it is, but also how professional the organizations are that perpetrate these types of scams, hopefully that really helps get rid of some of the stigma that I think we naturally tend to associate with these issues, because it really is, you've made clear that these are not kind of amateur attempts. These are incredibly sophisticated efforts.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think that's exactly the point where, there's no shame in being a victim, because so many people today are falling victim to these things. So yeah, I think, it's all about awareness and having these discussions like we're having today.
Well, thank you very much, Eliza, for sharing your time and your insights with us. And thank you all, of course, as ever, very much to our audience for joining us today on this Themis podcast. For now, I'll say goodbye from me, Henry, and goodbye from you, Eliza.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. This was great today.
It's a pleasure. Take care and good luck to everyone. Stay safe out there.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Themis Podcasts. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to find out more about Themis, please do contact us via our website at wearethemis.com or drop us an email at info@wearethemis.com. Thank you.